On August 7, 1942, 11,000 American Marines stepped onto the humid beaches of a remote Pacific island called Guadalcanal, carrying a terrifying secret. They were backed by the largest industrial economy in human history, a nation capable of churning out thousands of tanks, planes, and ships every month. Yet, within 48 hours of landing, those Marines found themselves abandoned, stranded on a strip of dirt with less than 30 days of food, a critically depleted supply of ammunition, and zero heavy equipment. If you look at the surface of military history, Guadalcanal is remembered as a brutal fight of infantry tactics, night naval battles, and raw human endurance. But if you analyze the campaign like a forensic investigator looking at a crime scene, a completely different reality emerges. The military disaster on the beach wasn't caused by tactical failure. It was caused by a cold, mathematical imbalance on a balance sheet 4,000 miles away. Before a single Marine fired a shot in the jungle, a quiet bureaucratic battle in Washington had already written their operational budget, and the numbers simply did not add up. To understand why the richest country on Earth left its own soldiers starving on an island, you have to follow the paper trail back to the War Production Board in early 1942. At that precise moment, American factories were undergoing the largest industrial transformation in history. Auto plants in Detroit were tearing out assembly lines for civilian cars to build bomber engines. Steel mills in Pittsburgh were shifting from bridge girders to battleship armor. On paper, the production figures looked staggering. Billions of dollars were being poured into the war effort, but money on a spreadsheet does not fire a bullet, nor does it carry a crate of rations across 6,000 miles of ocean. The real currency of the Pacific War wasn't cash, it was cargo tonnage, and in August of 1942, the United States was completely bankrupt in cargo ships. When the U.S. Navy launched Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal, it was playing a desperate financial gamble with borrowed time and missing inventory. The ships sent to transport the invasion force were crammed so tightly that longshoremen in California had packed them in reverse order. Crate after crate of critical medical supplies, heavy artillery, and spare parts were buried deep inside ship holds, locked underneath tons of non-essential equipment. When Japanese warships suddenly ambushed the Allied fleet in the dark waters of Savo Island, sinking 4 cruisers in less than an hour, the transports were forced to cut their anchor chains and flee. They took more than half of the invasion force's supplies with them back into the open ocean, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal stranded with a broken supply chain. The ledger was now in the red, and the daily cost of survival began to compound rapidly. Consider the physics of keeping a single Marine operational on that island. Every day, that soldier required 3 pounds of food, dozens of gallons of fresh water, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition just to stay combat effective. Multiply that by 11,000 men, and the daily material cost became a crushing weight. With their primary supply ships gone, the Marines were forced to audit their own survival. They immediately cut their food intake to 2 meager meals a day, and much of that was captured Japanese rice. They scavenged enemy shovels to dig their trenches, used captured enemy trucks to move equipment, and harvested leftover enemy fuel to run their generator networks. The wealthiest military force on the planet was operating entirely on scavenged scrap, because the industrial engine behind them had hit a catastrophic bottleneck. That bottleneck wasn't a lack of raw materials. It was the friction of distance. Every single drum of aviation fuel, every shell casing, and every box of field rations consumed on Guadalcanal had to travel across a 6,000-mile logistical pipeline stretching from the American West Coast to the South Pacific. In 1942, a cargo ship moving across that vast expanse burned tons of precious oil every single day just to make the trip. This created a vicious economic feedback loop. The more ships the U.S. Navy sent to supply Guadalcanal, the more fuel those ships consumed, which in turn required even more fuel tankers to supply the fleet. The shipping pipeline was eating its own tail, consuming more resources than it could actually deliver to the front lines. And then came the fuel math on the island itself. where the entire campaign hinged on a single patch of dirt known as Henderson Field. Henderson Field was a captured airfield, and the aircraft operating from it, known as the Cactus Air Force, were the only thing stopping total Japanese victory. If those planes ran out of fuel, Japanese warships could sail up to the island at night and bombard the Marines with impunity. But the economics of keeping those planes in the air were nightmare scenario logistics. Every drop of high-octane aviation gasoline had to be shipped in steel drums, rolled across jagged coral reefs by hand, hauled through knee-deep mud, and manually hand-pumped into airplane fuel tanks. If a single drum leaked in transit, or was punctured by enemy shrapnel on the beach, the operational capability of the airfield plummeted instantly. During the darkest days of October 1942, the supply of aviation fuel on Guadalcanal dropped so low that engineers were forced to drain fuel from crashed, ruined bombers just to keep 2 or 3 fighter planes in the air. The margin between survival and total collapse was measured not in regiments or regiments of men, but in individual gallons of gas. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was facing its own financial crisis, but of a fundamentally different kind. To the average observer, Japan appeared to be winning the economic war of attrition in late 1942. They were sinking American aircraft carriers, damaging battleships, and successfully landing thousands of elite troops on Guadalcanal under the cover of darkness. But if you look at the underlying structural accounts, Japan was burning through irreplaceable capital assets that it could never afford to replace. The Japanese economy was built on a fixed ceiling of resources. Unlike the United States, which had vast domestic oil fields, endless iron deposits, and a massive civilian workforce ready to be mobilized, Japan relied almost entirely on imported raw materials. To get fuel to their warships at Guadalcanal, Japan had to transport oil from captured fields in the Dutch East Indies thousands of miles back to Japanese refineries, process it, and then ship it back down to the Solomon Islands. Every time a Japanese destroyer raced down the channel to shell Henderson Field, it burned hundreds of tons of fuel oil that Japan could never mathematically restore. They were winning tactical engagements on the water, while bankrupted their long-term fuel reserves in the process. Yet, inside the American High Command, the situation looked just as bleak, because of a terrifying metric known as the replacement curve. In late 1942, American shipyards had not yet reached full mass production velocity. The revolutionary Liberty ships, the standardized freighters designed to win the logistical war, were still being built at a sluggish pace. Shipyard workers were still learning the welding techniques, and steel supply lines were chronically delayed. When the naval battles around Guadalcanal intensified, turning the waters off the coast into a ship graveyard known as Iron Bottom Sound, the U.S. Navy was losing warships faster than American factories could build them. In November of 1942, the balance sheet reached its most dangerous threshold. If the loss rate of cargo transports and destroyers continued at that velocity for another 60 days, the U.S. Navy would run out of usable operational tonnage in the South Pacific entirely. The entire Pacific strategy was sitting on the edge of a financial precipice. Then, a subtle, almost invisible pivot occurred on the factory floors back home. It didn't happen with a dramatic speech or a decisive tactical victory at sea. It happened in the mundane offices of industrial planners who radically restructured how supply lines were organized.